As I'm joined by a very good friend of mine, a special human being he is too, never knowingly anything but misanthropic. It is Mr. Benedict Spence. Good morning, Benedict.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm not good, if I'm honest.
I love the honesty. I love the candour. That's what it's all about here. How's the country?
Oh, the country is very nice when you're not having to interact with people. Sometimes you meet them on a footpath and you sort of have to, nod at them, and then that's fine. But apart from that, it's nice. There are cows, there's the great outdoors, there's limited amounts of pollution, but it is only a sort of a brief respite from then remembering what's going on in the rest of the country and being brought back down to earth with a bit of a bump.
So
There's only so
just to
much sort of idyllic scenery.
notify the audience, it's okay. Benedict Spence hasn't been checked into the Priory. He is just in the wilds of Norfolk or some such lovely part of real England, escaping the madness of London, and who can blame him? Talking about the madness of London, the madness of many parts of the country now. Nigel Farage, in his speech on Law and Order yesterday, has warned that Britain is facing societal collapse, with lawlessness taking hold very rapidly. We've seen protests as well against migrants' hotels in Epping Forest. I have a feeling that there are others simmering around the country. Is he overhyping this, or are we really on the brink of some sort of civic disorder?
I think, first and foremost, one has to remember that I don't think that the British people are a generally chaotic bunch. If what you might call civil disorder, I think it'll be, rather than sort of French-style rioting for the sake of it, I think that there could be that sort of thing, but I think that it would be more in the sense of an attempt to retake control and restore order, and people feeling the need to have to do it themselves. That's actually, I think, the key to much British sort of civil unrest, is simply that they would quite like things to work properly, and that's what they're going to try and instill of their own volition. And I think what we're seeing now is not an attempt at sort of social upheaval. It's not an attempt at revolution or civil war or anything like that. It is simply people voicing their displeasure at how things are currently being run in this country. I mean, there was a protest a couple of days ago in a town not too far from me in Norfolk that I know quite well, a sort of market town that you'd never get anything like that before, and that was to do with a migrant hotel. And it wasn't disorder. It wasn't people looking for a fight or anything like that. It was simply a protest. But I think when you get it in places like Epping or Diss or tiny little leafy towns like that, that's got to tell you that we are heading towards something hitherto unseen in this country. These aren't major industrial centres. These aren't sort of labourers demanding changes to their conditions. These are just ordinary people saying, "I want my system to work."
Yeah, and what can the Labour government now do? They've brought in this idea that they're going to target people smugglers with sanctions. I mean, what is that about? The way I see this idea of, well, if you've been part of people trafficking, you can't have a bank account. You're speaking to massive international criminal cartels who launder their money, for crying out loud.
Yeah, you need to just arrest people and you need to put them in prison for a very long time. And this is, I'm afraid, at the core of a lot of the problems in this country, is that the state exists to do two things above all else. And that is to uphold the system internally, that is to maintain the laws, protect those who follow them and punish those who don't, remove those who don't from society, and protect the borders, that is to say, maintain external security. Our governments, and I would say governments plural, for several years now, seem to think that this is just an option. They seem to think that this is a secondary thought, and that actually what matters are other things like healthcare, which actually is not a primary concern, or pensions or social care, which, again, I'm sure that there are going to be lots of people who get very angry at me for saying this. It is not the primary concern of government to make sure you are healthy and you are looked after in your day-to-day life. It is much more about maintaining law and order and your rights. Our government doesn't seem to think that that's particularly important. They're catching up to the fact now that people are starting to protest, but we've not had that for far too long. When it comes to things like people smugglers, it's quite clear. You don't smash the gangs by sanctioning them or getting somebody else to deal with the problem. You take them out of society. That is the point of prison. That is the whole point. It's not about proportional responses, proportional sentences to crimes, what an expert judges to be proportional. The point about state power, and this is as applicable when it comes to national security as internal security, is it is about the disproportionate application of power to make sure people do not do things that harm the majority.
Right, and I think this is the general feeling that the country has about this government. What are they doing about the migrants in hotels? Are they being deported? Are they being sent home? Are they being moved instead to casual encampments where they sleep on a concrete floor on some sort of mat as they're made to do in places such as Greece? No, they're dispersing them into private housing around the country. So Keir Starmer casually goes, we got lots of housing for the migrants. Don't you worry about that. Yeah. You might have lots of housing for the migrants. You don't have housing for the British folk, the million British people on the social housing waiting list. And that sense of unfairness, my feeling is it's now at a situation, and I understand actually, I have been told, although I cannot make claim that I know this for certain, that the Cabinet have actually discussed now the possibility of rioting breaking out if there happens to be just one more attack from a migrant or someone in an asylum hotel on a female in this country. And you think, well, you know, if we're at the stage that the government are having to discuss that behind closed doors, we really have gone beyond the 11th hour.
Yeah, and I mean, you're saying that you've been told it. I think it is very clear that they've been told that this sort of thing could potentially happen. I mean, amongst other things, why else would they keep it a secret from everybody that they were airlifting people out of Afghanistan and dropping people? And I know that they'll say that that was a matter of national security. It wasn't just that. That's not the only reason, especially seeing as they'd already told everybody on the internet that there were these people in Afghanistan to begin with. You can't really make the national security argument in that set of circumstances. There is actually a lot of available housing, empty housing in this country. He was not lying about that. The problem is where that housing is. It tends to be concentrated in parts of the country, particularly in the northeast, where it would be completely insane to drop people en masse in the manner that they'd have to. It would be very difficult to police, and you would effectively be creating ghettos where, you know, if the concerns of the government, which I believe are legitimate, are true, that a lot of people who come here, we don't know who they are, there is elements of extremism, there is elements of criminality, you'd be creating an even larger problem by taking them to those places that has a lot of excess housing stock. The argument was, at the very least, if you drop them in leafy suburban southern England and the Midlands and places like that, you'd be able to better keep an eye on these people. But that's not obviously been the case at all, because we've massively cut back on things like policing in this country. So, so when he says that that housing does exist, it's all very well and good that there are hundreds of thousands of houses around Teesside, for instance, but that's a really, really bad idea. That's even worse than putting people into hotels in the places that they are putting them into. That's partly why I suspect he wasn't prepared to say where a lot of this housing is.
Well, this is what a lot of people in Britain just don't understand is why are these people giving houses in the first place? You know, when you look at reports coming out of Cali, it's quite clear those people aren't sitting in houses. They're not being given PlayStations and four-star hotel rooms. When you look at scenes in Lampedusa, in Greece, when you look at where all of these other asylum seekers congregate in other countries, they're not being put in houses. The French government aren't saying, oh, here you go. You've come across the border from Spain or Italy. Where would you like to live? We've got a few houses in Lyon. We've got one down there in Nice. There you go. Go and enjoy yourselves. They're not given the same things. I don't understand why Britain seems to have a set of laws different from every other EU country, which seems to demand the government look after these people better than they're looking after British people.
Partly that's because British people believe that their own country is wealthier than it actually is. They believe that everybody should live in a certain standard or lifestyle, and it's simply not feasible. And this is, I think, the great black pill that is going to hit a lot of people in this country in the next couple of years, which is realizing quite how poor we are as a country. And spoiler alert, if you prioritize giving free things to people like cars or houses rather than economic growth, you will become poor really quickly. Rich people don't become rich by giving away all of their money. The other thing, I suppose, with France and Greece and countries like that behaving the way that they do is because they are trying to move these people on. They see themselves as a stepping stone to Britain. They understand the direction of travel, and they don't want these people hanging around in their countries any longer than they actually have to. The problem is we are the end destination. And that leaves you with a very awkward choice. Do you sit there and go, come on in? Or do you begin the very expensive, potentially quite dangerous, but I'm afraid very necessary step of saying to people, you have no right to be in this country and we're going to send you home? But of course, this being Britain, we're avoiding taking that final step.
Now I want to go back to Nigel Farage's law and order speech. The opposition parties to him clearly said, well, it doesn't add up, oh, it doesn't make sense, this is all wishful thinking, it's pie in the sky. What I would say to that is, well, at least someone's coming up with a bold plan rather than just saying we can't do anything. Do you think that what he has sort of pledged to do, such as putting people in prison for life sentences after committing 3 serious crimes, getting 30,000 extra prison places, 30,000 extra police officers, sending the hardest of criminals over to El Salvador? I like what it says on the tin, but is there anything inside the tin? Could it be done?
Sorry, I live in the countryside and my internet signal is absolutely appalling, so I'm afraid I've missed just about all of that.
OK, well, that's OK. We'll go back to the beginning, which is basically Nigel Farage came out of a bold set of policy pledges, or I don't know if they're pledges, but a direction of travel yesterday. And I was going to say to you, how much do you think these things are actually operable? If he gets into number 10, could he do these things? If it does involve uprooting the ECHR and the Human Rights Act and stopping net zero to get all the cash to pay for it, could it be done? Or will he find a civil service as intransigent as previous governments?
He will find the civil service very difficult to deal with. They will tell him at every opportunity that there are all sorts of legal limits to what he can do. This is partly because the civil service doesn't like the idea that Parliament actually is sovereign and can make laws. It decides, this is something that has happened over the last decade or so, is that various politicians, many of whom are former lawyers, have decided to try and set up a situation where only lawyers can decide actually what the laws are. And that's very nice and easy because it means if nothing ever changes, they don't have to work particularly hard. Certainly not with learning new laws or anything like that. So he will be told, no, there are all sorts of reasons why you can't do this. It will then sort of be funneled, if you like, into a legal battle, and it'll all be about what treaties Britain is a party to, what legislation needs to be rolled back. So I think people need to be prepared for this. Before Nigel Farage, if he becomes Prime Minister, which, to be clear, I still have a little bit of doubt that it'll happen, because British politics has a tendency to throw grenades at you at every possible opportunity. But were it to happen, he would obviously try to do these things, and then he'd be fighting endless legal battles. And that is the thing that Reform as a party needs to be prepared for, is that it cannot simply do the slightly sort of fly by the seat of your pants approach to politics. It can't be like the Trump administration. It needs to be red hot on every single piece of legislation that it wants to repeal, A, and B, what it is going to replace these things with. Because it's all very well saying we're going to leave the ECHR, we're going to rip up the Human Rights Act, but you need things in place to replace these things with, so that you have legal mechanisms to operate. This was one of the problems, of course, that we had with Brexit, was that we left and then we were scrabbling around to try and find a deal that was going to satisfy a series of people, none of whom actually agreed on what Brexit needed to look like. And that's, I think, part of the and that's one of the beauties that you have with a parliamentary democracy system. Once you're in power, if you've got a majority, it's a lot easier to do, to actually rush through that legislation and say, this is the bill, this is what we're going to have. It won't be like the Brexit negotiation, as long as Reform have these bills oven ready, if you like, ready to go. And I think, you were talking there about maybe this government won't last that long. Before we have the next general election. It could be 4 years, it could be sooner. This needs to be something that Reform, they need a legal department going through these things, fine-tooth comb, looking at all the things that you, A, need to repeal, but also the things that you don't want to accidentally throw out because they're quite useful. And so it's a very long, very painstaking process, but that's what they need to do, because without doing that, they can't then push ahead with any of their plans for deporting people to El Salvador or anything like that.
Benedict, before I let you go, a couple of messages I want to read to you. One says, sorry, Benedict, I've never been under the illusion that we live in a wealthy country. I've considered the country as third world, especially under 14 years of conservative austerity. And Sean in Tunbridge Wells says the total population of Teesside is around 400,000. Where are the hundreds of thousands of empty houses located?
There's quite a lot in Middlesbrough, I was actually led to believe. There used to be about 100,000 empty houses around the Middlesbrough area. It's possible that some of them have been knocked down because there were complaints that they've been left so long that they've become derelict. But you can't actually get away from the fact that there are an awful lot of empty houses in this country, predominantly in the north, the northeast. The places to look for them are former industrial centres that used to be very heavily populated. Now there's no reason for people living there. Of course, that's part of the reason why cities like, for instance, Bradford and Oldham have got very large migrant communities there because there was a lot of empty housing. And that's sort of what I'm getting at here. If you airdrop lots, hundreds of thousands of people from overseas into these communities, I'd ask people who are listening, has that been an absolute net win for those communities? Have things gone really well there? I'd argue probably not.
I think it's a very good point and very well made.